On the 9th of October, 1944, Winston Churchill sat across a table from Joseph Stalin in the Kremlin and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a half-sheet, the kind of paper you might use for a note, the kind of paper you might find on a desk and pick up without thinking too hard about it. He wrote 5 country names down the left-hand side: Romania, Greece, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Bulgaria. Next to each country, he wrote 2 numbers, one for the Soviet Union, one for Britain. Romania, 90% Soviet, 10% British. Greece, 90% British, 10% Soviet. Yugoslavia, 50-50. Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, 75% Soviet, 25% British. He pushed the paper across the table to Joseph Stalin. Stalin was 65 years old in October of 1944. He had ruled the Soviet Union since the late 1920s through a combination of political genius and systematic terror that had no precise parallel in the history of modern states. He had purged his own military high command in 1937 and 1938, executing most of his senior generals on the basis of fabricated evidence of treason at precisely the moment when Germany was rearming and the probability of war was highest. He had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in August of 1939 that had allowed the German army to attack Poland without fear of a Soviet response, and which had shocked the world. He had been genuinely surprised when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, despite months of intelligence warnings that the invasion was coming, because he had concluded that the warnings were a British attempt to draw the Soviet Union into war prematurely. He was a man who trusted almost no one and who had eliminated most of the people he had trusted before the war. He was also a man of considerable strategic intelligence who understood the relationship between military power and diplomatic leverage with the precision of someone who had spent his entire political career navigating precisely that relationship. He sat across the table from Churchill in Moscow in October of 1944, and he looked at the half-sheet of paper with the 5 country names and the percentages written next to them. He looked at it. He picked up his blue pencil. He made a large tick, a check mark, on the paper and pushed it back. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. Churchill looked at the piece of paper sitting between them, the paper that had the numbers on it. 90% for you, 10% for us. 90% for us, 10% for you. 50-50. The futures of Romania and Greece and Yugoslavia and Hungary and Bulgaria reduced to fractions, acknowledged with a pencil mark, in a room in Moscow while the war was still happening, and the people whose futures were being arranged were still fighting in it. He looked at the tick Stalin had made. He thought for a moment, and then he said something that is one of the most extraordinary statements in the entire history of Allied diplomacy. He said, "Might it not be thought rather cynical if it seemed we had disposed of these issues so fateful to millions of people in such an offhand manner? Let us burn the paper." Stalin looked at him. He said, "No, keep it." Churchill kept it. He later called it his naughty document. In the space of 2 minutes, over drinks in the Kremlin on an October evening, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin had divided the nations of Eastern Europe between them. The people of Romania, Greece, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Bulgaria had not been consulted. The United States had not been consulted. The agreement had no legal standing, no formal treaty structure, no mechanism for enforcement. It was a number on a piece of paper, acknowledged with a pencil tick. Churchill flew home and said nothing about it to anyone outside his immediate circle. Before we go any further, if someone in your family lived through the Soviet occupations of Eastern Europe, if they were among the millions of people whose futures were being assigned in percentages that evening in Moscow, drop their name and their country in the comments right now. We read every single one. And subscribe if you have not already, because what comes next is the story of what Churchill was trying to save and what he surrendered to save it. To understand why Churchill was in Moscow in October of 1944, making informal deals on scraps of paper without Roosevelt present, you have to understand what Britain's position in the war had become. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister since May of 1940. He was 70 years old in October of 1944. He had been in public life for longer than most of the men around him had been alive. He had served as a cavalry officer in Cuba, India, Sudan, and South Africa. He had been captured and escaped from a Boer prison camp in 1900. He had served in Parliament for more than 4 decades. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War and had proposed the Gallipoli operation, which had failed catastrophically and cost him his position. He had spent the 1930s in the political wilderness, warning about the rise of Nazi Germany, while the political establishment of Britain preferred to believe that accommodation was possible. He had been vindicated and appointed Prime Minister on the day Germany invaded France. He had survived 5 years of the most intense executive responsibility that any British leader had borne since the Napoleonic Wars. He had managed the relationship with Roosevelt with the specific skill of a man who understood that American involvement was the necessary condition for British survival, and who was willing to sacrifice British pride, British autonomy, and British treasure to maintain it. He had managed the relationship with Stalin with the more difficult skill of a man who understood that Soviet military power was essential to defeating Germany, but who trusted Stalin the way you trust a large predatory animal that is currently pointed in the same direction you are traveling. By October of 1944, he was tired. Not physically tired in the ordinary sense, though that too. The diary kept by his personal physician, Lord Moran, through the war years, documents a man who was in worse health than the public knew, who suffered from bouts of depression, he called. His black dog, who sustained himself through the war on champagne and brandy and cigars and the force of a personality that had been running at maximum output for 5 consecutive years. He was tired in a strategic sense. He could see what was coming. He could see that the war was going to end with the Soviet Union occupying Eastern Europe and with no realistic mechanism for removing it. He could see that the United States, despite its enormous power, was governed by a president who believed in agreements and declarations and the good faith of Allied partners in ways that Churchill's experience of Stalin did not support. He could see that Britain, financially exhausted and militarily overstretched, was going to emerge from the war that it had helped to win in a position of fundamental weakness relative to both of the other powers that had won it. What he could not see was how to change any of this. What he could perhaps do was save one thing. That one thing was Greece. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister since May of 1940. He had taken office at the worst possible moment. The German army was overrunning France. The British Expeditionary Force was being evacuated from Dunkirk, and the question of whether Britain could survive as an independent nation was genuinely open. He had answered that question with the force of his personality and his rhetoric and his refusal to acknowledge that the situation was as bad as it was. He had told the British people in speeches that have not aged that they would fight on the beaches and in the landing grounds and in the fields and in the streets and in the hills, and that they would never surrender. He had meant it. And the combination of the Royal Air Force's victory in the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, the German decision to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941, rather than attempting a cross-channel invasion of Britain, and the entry of the United States into the war after Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 had transformed Britain from a nation fighting alone for its survival into one of three partners in the most powerful military alliance in history. But the partnership was not between equals, and Churchill knew it more clearly in October of 1944 than he had known it at any previous point in the war. Britain had been fighting since September of 1939. 5 years of total war had consumed the country's financial reserves, its industrial capacity, its manpower, and its global position. Britain had entered the war as the center of the largest empire in the history of the world. It was emerging from it as a debtor nation, dependent on American financial support, with an empire that was beginning to make clear in various ways that it had no intention of remaining an empire after the war. The United States, by contrast, had entered the war in December of 1941 and had spent 3 years converting its enormous peacetime economy into the most productive military-industrial machine in the history of warfare. American industrial output dwarfed British output. American manpower reserves were larger. The American army that had landed in Normandy in June of 1944 was better equipped and better supplied than the British forces alongside it. The weight of the alliance had shifted irrevocably toward Washington. The Soviet Union had something different. It had territory. Its armies were on the ground across Eastern Europe. Romania had been occupied. Bulgaria was falling. Yugoslavia was contested. Hungary was next. Whatever agreements were made at the EO conference table about the post-war order in Eastern Europe, the practical reality was that the Red Army was going to be in those countries when the German armies left, and whoever was on the ground when a war ended had an enormous advantage in determining what came next. Churchill understood this with a precision that occasionally eluded Roosevelt and the American leadership. Roosevelt believed in the power of agreements, in the framework of the United Nations, in the principle of self-determination, in the premise that Stalin had signed declarations committing him to free elections and would honor those commitments because he had signed them. Churchill was more skeptical. He had been watching Stalin operate since 1941, and he had developed specific views about the relationship between what Stalin said and what Stalin did. Britain's relationship with Greece went back further than Churchill and further than the Second World War. Greece was the route through the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal route, the arterial passage through which British ships traveled to India, to Australia, to the empire that still provided the material substance of British power, ran through the Mediterranean. A hostile or Soviet-controlled Greece, at the eastern end of that sea, was not an abstract geopolitical problem. It was a direct threat to the logistical foundation of whatever remained of British power in the post-war world. Churchill had been thinking about Greece since at least 1943. In May of 1944, he had asked his Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden directly, "Are we going to acquiesce in the communization of the Balkans and perhaps of Italy?" He had answered his own question. Britain must resist. He had meant it. The specific threat in Greece was the communist-led resistance organization called the National Liberation Front, which in Greek abbreviates to something that sounds like EEAM. The National Liberation Front had done most of the fighting against the German occupation of Greece and had in the process built itself into the most powerful political organization in the country. When the Germans left, the National Liberation Front was going to be the dominant force in Greece. The question was whether the British-backed Greek government in exile in Cairo would be able to return and establish authority, or whether the communist resistance would take power in the vacuum the Germans left. Churchill intended to answer that question with British military force, if necessary. But British military force in Greece would be politically sustainable only if the Soviet Union was not simultaneously providing material and political support to the Greek communists. And Soviet restraint in Greece was not something Churchill could take for granted without some form of arrangement with Stalin. What Churchill was doing in Moscow in October of 1944, without Roosevelt, without American authorization, without any formal diplomatic framework, was trying to salvage what he could before the ground realities of the Red Army's position made salvage impossible. He was not trying to save Eastern Europe. He had already conceded most of it. What he was trying to save was Greece. Greece mattered to Churchill in a way that Romania did not, and Bulgaria did not, and Hungary did not. Greece sat at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. British ships using the Suez Canal route had to sail past Greece. A Soviet-dominated Greece would give the Soviet Union access to the Mediterranean in ways that would fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the post-war world. Churchill had been saying since May of 1944 in explicit terms that Britain must resist the communist infusion and invasion into Greece, and that he was willing to pay a significant price elsewhere to secure British dominance. There, the price, as he wrote it out on the half sheet of paper in the Kremlin, was Romania and Bulgaria. He was trading 90% of Romania and 75% of Bulgaria to Stalin in exchange for 90% of Greece. Yugoslavia and Hungary he described as 50-50, though these numbers would also shift in the days that followed. This was a transaction, a straightforward exchange of one nation's future for another's, conducted by two men with the power to make such transactions and the willingness to make them on a half sheet of paper at the end of an evening that had involved significant quantities of food and drink in the manner that Soviet diplomatic entertaining reliably produced. Churchill's doctor and the aides who accompanied him on these trips recorded consistently that meetings with Stalin were accompanied by hours of eating and toasting and drinking, and that Churchill, who was a formidable consumer of alcohol in ordinary circumstances, emerged from these evenings in states that ranged from mellow to well beyond mellow. The meetings of the Tolstoy Conference, as the Moscow gathering was codenamed, followed the pattern that all diplomatic meetings with Stalin followed. They began late. Stalin kept late hours, rising in the afternoon and working through the night, and his guests were expected to conform to his schedule. They were accompanied by enormous amounts of food and a sequence of toasts that required each participant to drain their glass completely each time. Stalin was known to control his own alcohol intake more carefully than he encouraged his guests to control theirs. Anthony Eden, who attended several such dinners, later wrote that the toasting was relentless and that declining a toast was not socially acceptable in Stalin's dining room. Churchill was a formidable consumer of alcohol by any standard. His daily routine across the war years involved champagne at lunch and brandy in the evening, and he maintained this schedule in Moscow without modification. His physician, Lord Moran, who accompanied him on many of these trips, kept detailed notes about Churchill's physical condition and noted with some regularity that his patient was consuming more than was medically advisable. Whether Churchill was specifically drunk in the moment when he pushed the paper across to Stalin cannot be confirmed from the primary sources. What can be confirmed is that it was late in the evening, that substantial amounts of alcohol had been consumed by both parties in the standard diplomatic way that all meetings with Stalin concluded, and that Churchill himself described the document. He produced as naughty a word that implies some awareness that what he was doing would not bear the scrutiny of daylight. The morning after the evening of the 9th of October, Churchill sent Stalin a written summary of what had been agreed the previous night. This document, which was intended as a record of the informal understanding, was returned to Churchill by Stalin with specific phrases struck out. The phrases Stalin removed were the ones that implied the creation of binding spheres of influence. Stalin, it turned out, wanted the practical benefits of the percentages arrangement without the documentary evidence that he had agreed to anything that limited his freedom of action. Churchill had proposed burning the paper the night before, and Stalin had told him to keep it. Now, in the morning, Stalin was editing the written record to remove the elements that made the agreement look like what it was. This is not an insignificant detail. It suggests that Stalin understood the agreement as something less than Churchill understood it to be, and that his blue pencil tick the previous evening had been a gesture of polite acknowledgment rather than a formal commitment. Churchill chose not to emphasize this in his memoirs. He described the agreement as having been made and as having been honored where it mattered, which was Greece. He did not dwell on the fact that Stalin had struck out the phrases implying binding obligation. The conference had been Churchill's idea, and he had arranged it without Roosevelt's knowledge or involvement in a way that was characteristic of his operating method at this stage of the war. Roosevelt was in the middle of his re-election campaign, seeking an unprecedented fourth term. As president, he had sent a telegram to Stalin in October expressing regret that his campaign kept him from attending the Moscow summit. He had asked that his ambassador to Moscow, Avril Harriman, be allowed to attend as his representative. Stalin politely declined, allowing Harriman to attend some sessions as an observer, but excluding him from the key conversations. Harriman was present at the Moscow conference, but was not in the room during the specific meeting on the evening of the 9th of October. Roosevelt received a telegram from Churchill on the 10th of October, summarizing the broader discussions about Eastern Europe. The telegram did not mention specific percentages. It did not mention the half sheet of paper. It did not mention Stalin's blue pencil tick. Roosevelt was given a general summary of what had been discussed without being told the specific terms of what had been agreed. This was not accidental. Churchill knew that the United States government, under Roosevelt and under the principles of the Atlantic Charter that Roosevelt had championed, formally opposed the division of Europe into spheres of influence. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had been explicit that American policy rejected such arrangements. Churchill was negotiating something that American policy opposed with the leader of an ally whose cooperation he needed, without telling the Americans what he was doing. Subscribe right now if this story is giving you something. Every like and subscription tells the algorithm this deserves to reach more people. What comes next is what the naughty document actually produced. The 2 days that followed the evening of the 9th of October produced a further set of negotiations between Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, and Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister. Eden and Molotov sat down with the percentages and tried to negotiate the details, what the numbers meant in practice, how they would be implemented, what structures would give them effect. The result of the Eden-Molotov discussions was that the percentages for Bulgaria and Hungary were both revised upward to 80% Soviet. Eden later admitted that he had not been entirely sure what the original 50-50 split of Hungary was supposed to mean in practice, and that the revision to 80% Soviet seemed to reflect the military realities on the ground more honestly than the original figure had. Eden was not wrong about the military realities. The Red Army was in Bulgaria. It was entering Hungary. The question of whether a piece of paper saying 50% British influence in Hungary had any practical meaning when Soviet tanks were rolling through Hungarian cities was the question that neither Churchill nor Eden ever fully resolved. Churchill believed the percentages created a diplomatic framework that gave Britain leverage. His critics, both at the time and since, believed they gave Britain nothing at all and simply acknowledged Soviet predominance in territories where the Red Army was already in control while asking for nothing that could be enforced. Churchill's specific defense of the agreement focused on Greece, because Greece was the one place where it demonstrably worked. In December of 1944, 2 months after the Moscow meeting, communist resistance forces in Greece, the main communist resistance organization, attempted to seize power in Athens. British forces were still in Greece following the German withdrawal, and Churchill ordered them to use military force to suppress the communist uprising. The fighting in Athens in December of 1944 and January of 1945 was brutal. British troops fought communist Greek partisans in the streets of the Greek capital. It was an extraordinary situation. British forces fighting the resistance fighters who had been their allies against the Germans just weeks earlier, now classified as enemies in a post-war struggle for political control. Stalin did not intervene. He did not send weapons to the Greek communists. He did not provide material support. He did not use Soviet influence to push the British out of Greece. Whatever the percentages agreement meant in practical terms, it meant this: when Churchill was suppressing a communist insurgency in Greece, Stalin stood aside. Churchill later credited the percentages agreement with producing this outcome. Some historians agree with him. Others, including scholars who have had access to Soviet archives that were not available to Churchill, have concluded that Stalin had already decided before the Moscow meeting that Greece was not worth a confrontation with Britain. His restraint in Greece may not have been a consequence of the percentages agreement. It may have been a consequence of his own assessment that the Mediterranean was not where Soviet strategic interests lay. This ambiguity, whether the naughty document achieved what Churchill believed it achieved, or whether Stalin would have behaved the same way regardless, is one of the reasons historians have argued about the percentages agreement for 80 years without reaching a consensus. What the agreement did not do was save Romania, Bulgaria, or Hungary. Romania fell to Soviet-dominated governance within months of the end of the war. The communist forces installed by Soviet pressure eliminated the other political parties through arrest, exile, and intimidation. The agreement had given Romania 90% to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union took exactly that. The British consul in Bucharest filed reports describing the systematic dismantling of democratic institutions. The British Foreign Office received these reports and filed them. The 10% British influence that the percentages agreement had reserved for Britain in Romania did not translate into any capacity to alter what was happening there. Bulgaria proceeded along the same lines. Hungary followed. Yugoslavia, which Churchill had designated 50-50, became a communist state under Tito. Though Tito's particular form of communism maintained its independence from Moscow in ways that made the Yugoslav case more complicated than the simple percentages implied. The millions of people whose futures Churchill and Stalin had assigned in percentages on an October evening in Moscow did not, in almost all cases, receive the democratic self-determination that they had been promised at various wartime conferences. They received what was on the ground when the war ended, which was the Red Army. Roosevelt's reaction when he did eventually learn the full details of the Moscow meeting is documented in the letters and communications between him and Churchill in the months that followed. He was not pleased. The American position on spheres of influence had been established clearly and repeatedly. The Atlantic Charter of 1941, which both Roosevelt and Churchill had signed, committed both countries to the principle that territorial changes would not be made without the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned. A secret agreement between Churchill and Stalin assigning percentages of influence over European nations was precisely the kind of great power arrangement that the Atlantic Charter was supposed to have ended. Churchill had anticipated this problem. He had been deliberately vague in his telegram to Roosevelt about what had been agreed in Moscow. He had not lied to Roosevelt exactly. He had simply not told him the specific numbers he had written on a half sheet of paper and the tick that Stalin had put on them with a blue pencil. The distinction between not lying and not telling the truth is one that Churchill navigated with more comfort than most political leaders. The consequence of this evasion was that when the three leaders gathered at Yalta in February of 1945, they signed the Declaration on Liberated Europe as though the Percentages Agreement had never happened. The Declaration promised free elections and democratic self-determination to the peoples of Eastern Europe, which was to say, it promised to the people of Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary the opposite of what Churchill had already assigned them in the Kremlin in October. Nobody mentioned the percentages at Yalta. The Percentages Agreement was simply parallel to the Yalta Declaration rather than superseding it or being superseded by it. Two incompatible frameworks existed simultaneously. The public one said free elections. The private one said 90% Soviet. The private one was the one that the Red Army was in a position to enforce. The Iron Curtain speech that Churchill delivered at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, in March of 1946. The speech in which he told the world that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent, named exactly the countries he had assigned to Soviet influence on his half-sheet of paper: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia, all the capitals of Central and Eastern Europe behind that curtain. Churchill delivered this speech with the specific authority of a man who had been warning about Soviet intentions since before most of his audience had been paying attention. He was right that the Iron Curtain was there. He had been one of the men who, in a specific and documented way, had decided where it would fall. At the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin gathered to determine the post-war order, the Percentages Agreement was never mentioned. Roosevelt did not raise it. Churchill did not raise it. It sat in Churchill's files, his naughty document, while the three men signed a declaration on liberated Europe that promised free elections to precisely the countries that Churchill had already assigned to Soviet predominance the previous October. Stalin signed the Yalta Declaration. He had also, in the interpretation of at least one school of historical thought, already received Churchill's acknowledgment that 90% of Romania was his. Whether the Yalta Declaration superseded the Percentages Agreement, or whether the Percentages Agreement made the Yalta Declaration meaningless from the start, was a question that the Eastern Europeans who spent the next 45 years under Soviet domination had their own views about. Churchill published the Percentages Agreement in the final volume of his memoirs in 1953. He defended it. He said it had achieved its primary purpose of keeping Greece out of the Soviet sphere. He said it had been a realistic accommodation to military facts on the ground, rather than a cynical abandonment of Eastern Europe. He said Stalin had honored the Greek element of the agreement. The Soviet government, when Churchill's memoirs appeared, called the Percentages document dirty and crude. They denied that any such agreement had been made, or that Stalin's blue pencil tick represented a binding commitment to anything. The convenient thing about an informal agreement on a half-sheet of paper over drinks in the Kremlin is that it has exactly the legal standing you want it to have at any given moment, which is none. The honest verdict on the naughty document requires looking at what Churchill was actually trying to accomplish and measuring it against what he actually achieved. He was trying to preserve British influence in Greece, He succeeded. Greece did not become a Soviet satellite. It remained in the Western sphere through the Cold War, eventually joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1952. Whatever the causal relationship between the percentages agreement and this outcome, the outcome itself was what Churchill had been trying to produce. He was trading Eastern Europe to achieve it. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary did become Soviet satellites. The people of those countries spent decades under political systems that Churchill's agreement had, at minimum, acknowledged as the likely outcome and made no attempt to prevent. Churchill later said, in a letter to Anthony Eden, that the naughty document had been intended as a provisional working arrangement to guide military operations during the final phase of the war, not as a permanent division of post-war Europe. This is a generous interpretation of what he wrote on that half-sheet of paper. The numbers he wrote and the tick Stalin made on them do not obviously read as provisional. What they read as is what Churchill himself said they read as when he suggested burning the paper. Cynical. He was right that they were cynical. He was also right that they were produced by a man who understood the limits of what was possible in October of 1944. The question that Churchill's defenders have always asked is what the alternative was. The Red Army was in Romania. It was entering Bulgaria. Soviet power was going to be present in Eastern Europe regardless of whether Churchill made an agreement about it or not. By making the agreement, Churchill at least extracted a commitment about Greece, a commitment that, in his view and by his evidence, Stalin honored. Without the agreement, he had nothing. With it, he had Greece. The question that Churchill's critics have always asked in response is what the agreement cost. Not just Romania and Bulgaria, though those were real costs paid by real people. The agreement also confirmed to Stalin that the British were willing to negotiate the political futures of third countries without those countries' participation, that they were willing to make such deals informally and secretly, and that the Atlantic Charter's promises of self-determination were negotiable when British strategic interests required it. This confirmation, his critics argue, was not the acknowledgement of an existing reality. It was the legitimization of a practice. Churchill was not just accepting that the Red Army would be in Romania. He was agreeing that Soviet predominance in Romania was a legitimate diplomatic outcome that Britain would recognize and not challenge. The difference between those two things, accepting what cannot be stopped versus legitimizing what you are not stopping, is the moral heart of the argument about the naughty document. Churchill burned nothing. He kept the paper. He published it 9 years later in his memoirs and defended it. He was not a man given to sustained regret about decisions he had made, even the ones that other people paid for. The people of Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were not given copies of the paper or the memoirs. They were given what the paper had assigned them. He was right that they were cynical. He was also right that they were produced by a man who understood the limits of what was possible in October of 1944, and who made the most realistic available calculation about which of those limits he could afford to push against and which he could not. That is not the same thing as saying he was right. Millions of people in Eastern Europe would have had sharp views about the difference. Churchill's Dr. Moran wrote in his diary about the Moscow meetings that Churchill seemed older and more tired than he had seen him, that the combination of the travel and the late nights and the sustained diplomatic pressure and the food and drink that Stalin deployed as both hospitality and weapon had produced in Churchill a condition that was the outer edge of what a man in his 70s could sustain. And yet, Churchill had come to Moscow precisely because he believed that what could be arranged in a direct meeting with Stalin could not be arranged any other way. He was probably right about this. Stalin did not operate through formal diplomatic channels in the way that the American system encouraged Roosevelt to operate. Stalin operated through personal encounters, through direct conversations, through the specific reading of another man's face and body language that he had been doing for decades of political survival. Churchill understood this about Stalin because he had a version of the same quality himself. The naughty document was the kind of arrangement that could only have been made the way it was made, late at night, informally, over drinks, by two bold men with enormous power and no lawyers in the room. Whether it should have been made at all is the question that history has not finished answering. The paper still exists. It is in the British National Archives. It is a half sheet of paper with 5 country names written in Churchill's handwriting and a large blue pencil tick made by the man who ran the Soviet Union. You can look at it and try to calculate what it was worth and what it cost, and whether those 2 numbers came out even. The people whose names Churchill was abbreviating into percentages that evening could tell you. That is the story. That is the record. Before you go, we want to know what you think. Was Churchill right to make the naughty document, to trade Romania and Bulgaria for Greece in a late-night meeting in Moscow without telling the Americans? Or was this the moment that sealed the fate of Eastern Europe, conducted with a cynicism that Churchill himself acknowledged but could not bring himself to abandon? And here is the question underneath all of it. If Churchill had refused to make the agreement, if he had insisted on free elections for Romania and Bulgaria the way the Atlantic Charter promised, would Stalin have honored it? Or would the Red Army have taken those countries anyway, and Churchill would simply have had nothing to show for the effort? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us what story we should cover next. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you do not miss next week. These videos take extensive research to get right, and every like and subscription genuinely helps us keep making them. And if this story gave you something, the video on screen right now covers another decision made in a room between powerful men that determined the fate of millions of people who were not in the room. Watch that next. This is World War II Demand, the decisions that shaped the world, given the weight they earned.